King John of England. Was King John as bad as legends say? Well, yes. Yes, he really was. Any list of the worst kings in English history will have John, at the very least, in the top 3, and most likely put him at number 1. He was weak, cowardly, and treacherous. So much so that he became the symbol of bad rule. In the legend of Robin Hood, John is the evil king, and it's not that hard to see why. But where did John come from? And how did the youngest of 4 brothers come to the throne of England? John was born on December 24th, 1166, in Oxford. He was the youngest son of Henry II of England and his wife, Eleanor of Aquitaine. John was the last child born to Eleanor. At least 5 of her children were boys. William, the first son of Eleanor and Henry, would die as an infant. The rest were Henry, Richard, Geoffrey, and the aforementioned John. For once, an English king had the odd issue of having too many sons who made it to adulthood. Eleanor and Henry ruled over an empire which included England and pretty much all of western France, along with Ireland and Wales. To provide for all of his sons, Henry decided that on his death his empire would be divided. Henry the Younger, as the eldest son, would inherit the lands that Henry II had inherited when he came to the throne: Normandy, Anjou, and the crown of England. Henry was indeed crowned as a co-king with his father. However, he was not given any real power. Richard would inherit his mother's duchy of Aquitaine. Meanwhile, Geoffrey was set to inherit the county of Brittany. This plan to divide the empire left John without any land. However, in 1173, Henry II was in the process of negotiating a marriage for John. When asked what lands John would hold, Henry answered by naming 3 important castles in France. When Henry the Young King, whom I will simply refer to as the Young King from now on, heard about this, it drove him into a rage. He believed these castles were his by right, and Henry giving them to John was an outrage. This sparked a rebellion with the French king and Eleanor herself backing the young king, along with his 2 eldest brothers, Geoffrey and Richard. While this is a complex war to unfold, the long and short of it was that Henry beat pretty much everyone who tried to attack him. Once the war was over, Henry pardoned his sons and gave them increased allowances, but refused to give the young king that power he so desired. Richard and Geoffrey were sent off to the lands they were meant to inherit. Eleanor, who may have instigated the rebellion, was less fortunate. Henry held her responsible and had her locked up in a castle for the rest of his reign. John, however, seems to have done quite well out of it all. As the only son who had not rebelled, Henry started showing more and more favor to him, giving him lands and castles at the expense of the young king. In 1177, Henry made John Lord of Ireland. This was another attempt to give him real power. However, John's first trip to Ireland ended in disaster. He crawled back to England, blaming others for his failings. Henry's attempts to provide for John should have been made easier when his eldest son, the young king, died in 1183, and later his 3rd son, Geoffrey, died in 1186. Geoffrey left behind 2 daughters and a baby boy, Arthur, who would inherit Brittany. But as the young king left no children, on his death he left Richard as the heir. In the autumn of 1188, Richard agreed to an alliance with the new king of France, Philip II. Richard had been driven into this alliance because Henry, feeling that Richard should be more than happy with England, Normandy, and Anjou, tried to force Richard to hand Aquitaine over to John. Richard, who had spent most of his teenage years suppressing rebellions and managing the complex politics of that region, refused to do so. When Henry finally backed Richard into a corner, Richard gave control back over to Henry, but at once fled to the court of France. Philip II and Richard would prove to be a much more formidable team than the Old King and Henry the Young King ever had. Richard was born for warfare, and while many claim that he is the most overrated king in English history, his legendary skill in battle was all too real. However, this is not his tale. John seems to have been on Henry's side, but as Richard and Philip slowly began winning castles and battles, John and many other nobles jumped side and joined Richard. Henry's health seems to have been in decline for most of the winter of 1188 to 1189, and this seems to have begun to slow him down. His lightning-fast movements were no longer the same as in 1173. Richard and Philip gained considerable ground. For the first time since he became King of England, Henry was losing a war. By July of 1189, Henry was forced to sign a humiliating treaty, where he agreed to pardon all those who rebelled against him, and was forced to make Richard his sole heir. When Henry called for a list of those who rebelled so he could pardon them, it said that John's name was first on the list. This blow may have been what broke Henry once and for all. He had fought more than one civil war with his other sons to provide for John. And even considering the harsh realities of the time, Henry should have been able to expect higher of John. But this was the first in a long list of reasons why people would grow to distrust John. Henry's death on the 6th of July put John in an interesting position. As the oldest son, Richard was crowned king. But John, who had been the fourth son to make adulthood, was now heir to the throne. When Richard was crowned king, he would spend only a matter of months in England before heading off to fulfill a vow he and the King of France made to go on crusade together. One of the things Richard had to deal with, though, was his brother. Richard did not trust John in the slightest, and first attempted to exile him till his return. However, he would change his mind, likely due to pleading from his mother. John would be allowed to remain in England, but under the rule of Richard's minister. Eleanor, who Richard had always loved very much and had released from imprisonment as soon as he became king, was also left with control in Richard's lands, likely in Aquitaine, as that was the land she came from. John, however, found himself in a quite enjoyable position. William Longchamp, Richard's chief minister, swiftly became unpopular due to his style of ruling. John set himself up as the opposition party, and swiftly became very popular with those who were disaffected with Longchamp. John became so popular, in fact, that he managed to stage a popular uprising against Longchamp, where he was arrested. Richard, upon hearing of John's power grab, sent a very able minister, Walter de Kunstz, home. He was to investigate what was going on and take over if he felt the need. To John's great distress, Walter did just that. John would continue to try and undermine Richard at every turn, but Walter and the Queen Mother seem to have more or less kept John under control until news of a huge event arrived in England. Richard had been captured on his return from crusade, and was being held for ransom by the Holy Roman Emperor, who demanded the absurd sum of £100,000. Walter and Eleanor began raising this sum, but before they could do so, John and Philip of France, who had gone on crusade with Richard, only to return much earlier, offered to match the price if the emperor would hand him over to them. However, the emperor was on shaky ground. Imprisoning a returning crusader was against church law, and the Pope in Rome had already made protests. In due time, the vast sum was handed over and Richard was set free. Philip is said to have sent a message reading, "Look to yourself, the devil is free," to John when Richard was released. Richard returned to England amid much fanfare and rejoicing, in spite of the heavy tax it took to complete his ransom. John is said to have been the first person to greet Richard on his arrival in England. He came begging forgiveness and blaming others for his rebellion. Richard granted it, with the disparaging comment, "Don't be afraid, John. You are a child, and have been in bad company. It is those who led you astray that will be punished." This was a rather forgiving attitude for Richard, considering all that John had done since he left. Not only had he overthrown one of Richard's ministers and sought to pay for Richard to remain in prison, but he had also attempted, rather unsuccessfully, to convince England that it would be cheaper and better to simply crown him. Moreover, while working with Philip, John gave him castles on the border of Normandy, an area that Henry II had vigorously defended. Any one of those actions should by all rights have had John kicked out of the kingdom. But likely on advice of Eleanor, he was spared this fate. By 1199, Richard had retaken pretty much all the castles lost by John to the French, and had even forced Philip into a peace deal. While sieging a small castle that was in rebellion, Richard received a fatal wound. On his deathbed, he nominated John as his successor. John seems to have conducted himself rather well after Richard's return, but it was likely his mother that convinced Richard to allow John a place in the succession. Richard may have been Eleanor's favorite, but she deeply cared about the rest of her sons. But it was not clear to all of Richard's nobles that John was the proper heir to the throne. John was the youngest of 4 brothers, and the third son, Geoffrey, had a child of his own before he died. That child was Arthur of Brittany, and it was a matter of great debate if John or Arthur had the better claim. Had he been alive, Geoffrey would have had a better claim than John, and most of Richard's lands in France believed that meant that Arthur was the real heir. And so while Normandy and England recognized John, Anjou, Touraine, and Brittany all recognized Arthur, who was also backed by Philip of France. John moved against Philip in Anjou and achieved a great coup. Peter de Roche, the most powerful man in the county, suddenly swapped sides, joining John and bringing Arthur of Brittany and his mother to make peace. However, they were so doubtful of John's true intent that they fled back to Philip after a single day in John's camp. In May of 1200, John and Philip signed a peace treaty. Many have criticized John for this truce. His detractors at the time would nickname him John Softsword. It's not hard to see why. The treaty was vastly one-sided. Philip agreed to recognize John as King of England and Lord of almost all the lands that Henry II held. However, in order for Philip to agree to this, John had to hand over the Vexin, a region between Normandy and France that Henry II and Richard had spent vast sums conquering and fortifying. Moreover, in exchange for recognizing John as Lord of Brittany, Philip managed to extort 20,000 marks sterling. The money payment may not have been a big deal, but the land given up was. Richard and Henry correctly identified this as the key to defending Normandy, and had fought hard to maintain it. In a single treaty, John had handed over pretty much the whole of the land that Richard had fought to recapture and maintain after his crusade. Why would he do it, though? It was likely for economical reasons. Taxation was already high, and to continue fighting might have bankrupted the crown. But it is likely that was only part of the reason. John seems to have had an appetite for power, but not an appetite for battle. His brother had had both. On July 29th, 1202, Eleanor of Aquitaine was besieged in her castle of Mirabeau. The army besieging her was led by her only grandson, Arthur of Brittany. The goal of the siege was to capture Eleanor and use her as a hostage against John. Ever since the peace treaty had been signed, Philip had been massing an army. In the spring of 1202, he turned this army against John, declaring as John's overlord that his lands in France were forfeit, and that Arthur was now Duke of Brittany and Aquitaine, along with Count of Anjou and Maine. This can hardly have been a shock for John. Philip had already shown his feelings on the matter of honor when he invaded Richard's lands while he was away on crusade. A breach of church law which stated that Crusader lands were off limits under all circumstances. Eleanor managed to send a note to John, who was in Normandy, begging him to send aid as soon as he could. It would take a miracle for John to manage it. However, John was about to summon his greatest miracle. His father had had a habit of moving at great turns of speed, and so confusing and weakening his enemies. John was about to do the same thing. Covering 80 miles from Normandy to Mirabeau in less than 48 hours, they arrived in the evening of July 31st, to find that Arthur was already in the town, and the walls were held against them, with all but one gate blocked by a huge pile of stones and dirt. William de Roche, who knew the town well, agreed to lead an attack so long as he got a leading voice in Arthur's fate. It was a deal John was happy to make. At dawn, de Roche launched a vicious assault which carried the town walls. A brutal fight ensued, in which de Roche would have 3 horses killed out from under him. The town was carried, and when the rebels tried to flee to the castle, all of them were killed or captured, including Arthur and over 250 knights. It was a stunning victory, and if John could duplicate it versus the King of France, he would be the greatest king in Europe. But it was not to be. This was the high point of John's reign. He paraded the prisoners in public to Normandy, where Arthur was locked up in Falaise. The imprisonment of Arthur was to slowly become a scandal as rumors spread of John keeping him in horrid conditions. As John's only possible heir and a noble of high rank, keeping him in such conditions was considered the worst kind of crime. As Arthur remained in prison, Normandy was collapsing around John, though. In September of the same year as Arthur's capture, William de Roche was cut out from any say in Arthur's fate. Agreeing to terms, only to ignore them, was starting to become all too common with John. To the shock of no one, de Roche left John for Philip a month later. De Roche began raiding Anjou, and eventually, with the aid of rebellions, took Angers, the capital of the county. John managed to hold out in Anjou until December of 1202. Rebellion in Anjou spread to Aquitaine. Eleanor, through her diplomacy and the general respect felt for her, managed to keep John in control of that province for a while, but she was an old woman and her health was failing. John retreated to Normandy in December and garrisoned his castles there with mercenaries. This alienated many in the duchy. As his 3rd year came to a close, it was clear that pure chaos had overtaken his lands. It would have strained the powers of the greatest of English kings to regain his position, and John could hardly be called great. In 1203, word leaked that Arthur had died in prison. While this was untrue and swiftly disproven, it caused a wave of rebellion throughout Brittany. In January of 1203, what castles John had left in Anjou fell. By spring, John was all but beaten. Philip and his allies controlled all of Brittany, Anjou, Touraine, and Maine. The rebels were now pushing hard in Aquitaine, where Eleanor was now too old and frail to organize a defense. The Thursday before Easter that year, Arthur and John were both in Rouen. No one knows for sure what happened next, but it is not hard to guess. John seems to have been in a towering rage, as well as have been drunk. Whether John killed Arthur with his own hands or ordered it done is unsure. But Arthur was murdered that night, and once his death was known abroad, John became the chief suspect. John had feared betrayal at every turn. As rumors of Arthur's fate spread, these fears became all too real. Arthur's death put John in an impossible position. In all future peace negotiations, Philip had a trump card up his sleeve. As he would state, "No peace until you first produce Arthur." As John could not do this, any talks of peace were doomed. Philip continued pushing into Normandy as the summer came. Castles on the border simply submitted, at times without a fight. In August of 1203, Philip lay siege to the greatest of the Norman fortresses, Chateau Gaillard, a monster of a fortress that controlled the gateway between Rouen and Paris. John sent an expedition to try and relieve the fortress. It was meant to be a combined water and land attack. The land army made it on time and drove the French from their side of the river. However, the navy was nowhere to be seen. It seems they had not taken into account the difficulties and delays of traveling upriver. Without the navy to back them up, the land force was in turn defeated by reinforcements from across the river. The navy arrived, but they were too late and forced to retreat. John does not seem to have made any more attempts to rescue Chateau Gaillard. The siege would continue until 1204. By autumn of 1203, there was a growing sense that John had lost complete control of his lands in France. In December of 1203, John left Normandy for the last time. He had promised to stay and fight at least one more year, yet John's word could never be relied on. Before the dawn of the 6th of December, John left Rouen and fled to the coast. Taking ship, he left for England and safer lands. Normandy had been under the control of English kings since William the Conqueror first won the crown. Now, after 5 generations, John had managed to lose the entire duchy in less than 5 years. He had come to the throne controlling more of modern-day France than the French king did. Now, as he sailed away, he left a few strongholds that were holding out in the hope that he would one day retake his lands. On April 1st, 1204, Eleanor of Aquitaine died. To the very end, she tried to protect and aid John. Even on her deathbed, she was trying to stem the tide of rebellion in Aquitaine through writing letters. By 1205, all of John's lands in France outside of Aquitaine had fallen, and that county was on the brink. In summer of 1205, John prepared a massive invasion on 2 fronts, one in Normandy and one in Aquitaine. John raised a sum greater than the whole cost of Richard's crusade. However, a mutiny by the English barons ended John's plans. A small expedition to Aquitaine to reinforce the stronghold there did set sail, but all the troops mustered and all the money gathered turned out to be a waste. In 1206, John started work on another campaign. In the spring of that year, he set sail for Aquitaine with the backing of his barons, many of whom had been bribed. He managed to secure Aquitaine, but when he pushed north into Anjou, he heard that Philip had raised an army and was marching south. John refused to give battle and instead retreated to Aquitaine and managed to agree to a truce with Philip. John was now forced to spend most of his time in England. He traveled around the country. He spent a considerable amount of time dealing with law and justice. This is often pointed to as a reason for John not being as bad as many have reported. Yet even in this case, John destroys his reputation. He was concerned with the plight of the poor, yet he also taxed and hoarded vast amounts of money from his subjects. And unlike Richard and Henry, John did not have stunning success to back up this taxation. He sat in judgment and gave his justice to all who came before him, no matter their rank. Yet he was not above ignoring his own laws if he felt the need. He exiled William Marshal, one of his greatest nobles, for the crime of giving the king advice. He hunted a favored family of nobles to extinction for knowing too many of his secrets. He dispensed justice, but it was for a fee, and for a bribe, someone could expect their case to be decided in their favor. Whatever the case, after the loss in France, John seems to have increased the taxation to a level never before seen in England. And at the same time, prices on everything from food to clothing was going through the roof. In 1208, the Church of England was put under an interdict, meaning that anything to do with the church ceased. Marriage, burial, and even the ringing of bells was banned by the Pope in Rome, due to a dispute over who should be Archbishop of Canterbury. Later, John was excommunicated personally. Rather than be scared, John took advantage of this. He confiscated all of the church's money and property. However, a plot to overthrow John in 1212 that held the backing of the Pope served to remind him that an excommunicated ruler could have a holy crusade declared against him. and this could be the basis for him being overthrown. He made peace with the church in September of 1212 by giving England to the Pope. Yes, you heard that right. The whole country of England. And agreeing to rule England as a subject of the Pope. In a stroke, John turned the Pope from his harshest critic into his firmest supporter. Yet, as with many of the treaties and peaces that John signed, he acted without thinking. In 1200, he gave up many of the most important fortresses between Normandy and France in a treaty. Now, in 1212, he gave up his authority, making himself a subject of the Pope. It would not come back to bother John, but many future kings of England would have reason to regret this move by him. With the Pope's backing, John now launched a two-pronged attack on France in 1214. With himself leading an army from England and a force of allies launching an attack on the northern French border. It started out well enough, but in July of 1214, Philip won a major victory at the Battle of Bouvines. John had managed to take back all of Aquitaine again, and even made peace with enemies on the border. He launched an attack into Brittany, taking many castles and towns through sieges. Angers had even opened its gates to him again without a fight. However, during a siege in Brittany shortly before Bouvines, John learned that the French king's son, Louis, was moving to attack him with an army. John felt that now was the time for a major battle, and so moved to fight him. John's French allies, however, refused and fled south. After this, John did not have the army to engage and had to retreat back to a fortress on the coast. In an almost startling fast amount of time, the lands John reclaimed fell back into French hands. When John's army from the north lost at Bouvines, the campaign was over. John had raised taxes to an insane amount to fund this expedition, and the only way it could have been justified was by victory in war. The complete failure of this campaign would cause rebellion in England. By May of 1215, the rebels had made it as far as London, and John was forced to concede to them. The concessions were drawn up in a list that would henceforth be known as Magna Carta, or the Great Charter. It was set out to limit the powers of the king, and determined that there were certain rights that even kings must respect. If that sounds familiar, then just know that almost all European countries, along with the United States, have Magna Carta as the basis for their government. John signed the document, but broke it almost at once. When John refused to abide the terms of Magna Carta, war resumed, with some of the rebels inviting Philip's son, Louis, to invade. In May of 1216, he invaded and made an unopposed entry into London. In October of that year, John was fleeing east when he caught dysentery. On October 19th, 1216, he died. On his deathbed, John begged the aging William Marshal, who was there, to take care of his eldest son Henry and act as the boy's regent. This Marshal agreed to, and in short order he had crowned the boy as Henry III, King of England, and had sent Louis packing. Maybe the thing that looks worst about John's whole career was how fast Marshal managed to stabilize England, yet it's hard to say. John had so many mistakes that to call any one of them the reason for him being a bad king would be wrong. He was untrustworthy, dishonorable, a failure at almost all military campaigns he launched, and perhaps worst of all, he was a bad politician. His reign started to collapse with the first treaty he made. He may have had some success, but it was undermined by bigger failures shortly after. His campaign in 1214 showed that he could succeed as long as all went well. Yet at the first moment of difficulty, he failed. This was in sharp contrast to his brother and father. And perhaps this is where John truly fails. Henry II is likely one of England's greatest kings, and Richard would become a legend. John's grandson would be Edward I, who would have staggering success in most areas in which John failed, from government reforms to justice and central power. Yet more than Henry or Edward, John will forever be tied to Richard. Richard's reputation has been attacked in more recent years, many claiming that he was really a failure of a king, and so John can't be blamed for his own reign. Yet some of the biggest issues Richard faced were his own brother's doing. Richard spent years regaining positioning in Normandy that John had given away while he was gone. In the end, John was not judged by the modern age. He was judged by his own time. And the verdict on John was Magna Carta. The verdict was that he was so bad, they had to try and change the way government and kingship worked. The greatest thing John gave the world was Magna Carta, and to him, it was a peace treaty barely worth the paper it was written on. Many may disagree, but I believe that John did something no other king of England did quite as badly. He failed as a king, to protect his birthright, to lead his armies, and to govern his lands. He failed as a man. He betrayed his own father after he had fought 2 wars for John. He killed his own nephew and heir. He was cowardly and untrustworthy. The verdict of John should be independent of Richard, and it is a failure either way. Richard left John a kingdom at peace and an empire that stretched from Scotland to Spain. Within 5 years, he had lost it, and with it he lost any hope of being called a good king.